So around 2 months ago, my rear shock started to blow up. The stanchion began to wear and sag would increase as I rode it, sometimes getting all the way to 60%. This led to some issues with performance, but also made it necessary to pump up the shock anytime I wanted to go on a ride, which was very inconvenient. Now, I'm not quite sure what this was caused by. It could have been a defect, but that's besides the point. I soon realized that this shock was in really, really bad shape, and I needed to get another one. Now came decision time. I could get the exact same shock, or something similar, but there wasn't anything wrong with the shock. It had rebound and compression adjustments, it went up and down, but I really wanted to try out something else. Maybe COIL? I watched some reviews, read some articles, and eventually stumbled upon the Marzocchi Bomber CR. From what I could tell, it had an extremely good value, which was a nice plus. After purchasing the shock and a spring, I received both a couple of days later, and I quickly installed the springs, slapped my bike in the bike stand, and exchanged the two shocks. The next day, it was time to take it out for a spin. Obviously, it's way different than a trail. Just stairs and some rocks over there. But it just feels a lot more planted. Feels like my back wheel just gets less air and it's just kind of more stuck to the ground almost. Feels really, really good. I keep on saying that, but I really like the feel of this COIL shock. So I pretty much got it all covered there, but I thought that I should mention just a couple more things. One, I didn't notice much of a difference bunny hopping or wheeling it. And two, the small bump sensitivity was the biggest difference. Even small bumps on really flat trails and sidewalks were completely smoothed out, which was really impressive. Also, I should say that this spring rate at 250 was a little soft for me. I think that a 300-pound spring would suit me a lot better. Also, I had the rebound fully open and the compression at around 3/4 open, so keep that in mind for the rest of the video. Now that we've taken it around the neighborhood, let's head up to the mountains and try it out on some bigger jumps. But before we can get to the fun stuff, let's talk about how it does on the climb. Actually, it doesn't feel that different. I know a lot of people say it's kind of feels as if you have a flat tire, but really, I think it's pretty similar. And it definitely soaks up the bumps while you're climbing, gives you more traction. I think that the weight of a COIL shock, and maybe it's a little bit less efficient, but I think it's definitely worth it for me because the downhill feels so much better and climbing over technical stuff feels just stuck to the ground. Okay, let's head over to some bigger jumps and drops and see how the COIL does in the air. I tested it out on a variety of them, so I got a pretty good idea of how it performed. Regular straight jumps and step ups felt pretty much the same to me, but the COIL definitely cushioned the landings of the step downs a bit more. Also, I will say that the run out was much smoother than with my air shock. Next, drops. This drop had a pretty well built up landing, so it's always super smooth. Sorry, I didn't hit any proper drops today. Finally, in the air, the COIL shock made no difference to the bike's handling, but going off the lips, I did notice that I needed to pop just a bit more. Not a big deal for me, as I soon got used to it. Alright, hope that you enjoyed that little edit. Gonna head over, do a trail down, and I think we're gonna go down Choop. They all wanted to do Star Wars, so I think I'm just gonna do a solo lap down Airborne. Now, this trail starts with some nice flowy berms that are mixed in with some rougher rooty sections. It then transitions into a steeper, though definitely not very steep, descent that is a bit more technical. The varied terrain on this trail definitely made it a great test track for the shock. Also, I tried to describe how it felt while I was actually riding, but it didn't work out too well, so I'll be doing voiceovers throughout this clip to try and convey my thoughts a little bit better. Supple. But wow, yeah, it definitely soaks up all those roots very well. Here's a nice rooty section. Dang, it's so planted. So what I'm trying to say here is that there was a noticeable difference with how much traction I had in these chunky root sections. The back wheel bounced around much less, and there was also less small vibrations going into my legs, although I still got a good amount of feedback from the trail. As a result, I was able to pick and hold my line with more confidence, which I really enjoyed. It was honestly really fun. Wow, it feels so planted in the corners. Yes, cornering was also improved with this shock. It felt like I had substantially more grip while turning, both in berms and on flat corners, which I liked a lot. It really allowed me to brake less coming into turns, resulting in more speed being carried throughout the trail. Sure? Alright. Have a good ride, you guys. I'd say at least as poppy as my air shock, if not more. Yeah, having a few rides on the shock, I can definitely say that this isn't entirely true. No matter what, air will be more lively on the trail than a coil shock. However, this doesn't mean that you can't pop off side hits with the coil. I can say from experience that you definitely can, but with less ease than with an air shock. Now, this steeper section is definitely pretty chunky and rutted out, and this is where the coil absolutely shines. I felt completely stuck to the ground, giving me the confidence to let off the brakes more than with my air shock, which was awesome. The traction was noticeably increased, also allowing me to choose my line with way more confidence. If you regularly ride chunky terrain like this, I would go with the coil 100%. Right. Yes. I mean, braking feels like I can slow down. Yes, Carson, it does feel like you slow down while braking. Funny how that is. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is that I felt as though I had more brake control with the coil, but I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because the wheel had more contact with the ground, so it was able to grab the dirt and slow me down more. Anyways, that's my theory, but I definitely wanted to mention that this is something I noticed on the very first ride. Now, I don't notice it at all anymore, but it's worth mentioning as it really surprised me. Here's a little steep section. This section is pretty fast and loose, with loose rocks rolling around that you can't really see on camera. This is another section where the coil provided huge benefits with traction, allowing me to brake less and choose my line more carefully. That was really sick. I'm gonna head up this little jump here. Unless it's all cleared out. Oh, it's not very cleared off. Yeah, that was a bottom out. Yeah, I definitely find that it's easier to bottom out. That was one of the only downsides for me. Full travel was a bit too easy to reach due to both my bike and the shock being pretty linear. However, I think that around a 50-pound increase in spring rate would help with this, and a progressive spring could solve it completely. I should mention that bottom outs were not at all harsh with the shock, and I only noticed a couple of times. Let's cut to future Carson, where I tell you who this shock is for. Alright, I'll be the first person to admit it, that did kind of turn into an air versus coil comparison, but that's just because I've only ever actually ridden a coil besides this one once. And it was a higher end coil. It was on a downhill bike that I demoed at North Star, which is obviously a lot different because the fork was also coil and just a downhill bike, which is way different than my enduro bike with the coil. And also, I just want to stress that this is not a full review. I'll be releasing that in a couple of months once I get a good idea with how this rides and I can tell you just a little bit more about it. So make sure to subscribe and turn on the notifications if you want to see when that video is released. So now I want to talk about who this shock is for. So the first person that this shock is for would be someone who wants to enter the realm of coil on a budget with the same feel as a high-end coil. The Bomber CR with a spring, which can range from $30 to like $130, is still comparable or a little bit less than a higher end shock without a spring, so that's pretty cool. The second person that this is for is someone that maybe has a coil on their bike, but then gets another bike or just upgrades their bike and it comes with an air shock. But they really like the feel of the coil and they want it on their bike as well. Maybe their old bike had a higher end coil, but they don't have enough money to spend on another higher end coil because they just bought a new bike. You'll get the same performance as a higher end coil with a smaller price tag. So moving on to the third person. Maybe someone who's going to be riding park or doing big shuttle days. Maybe you're going on a trip and you don't want to blow up your trail shock. You could buy one of these shocks, slap it on your bike, and get better or equal performance without blowing up your trail shock, which obviously you don't want to do. The fourth person that this is for is someone like me who blew up their shock, whether it be a person with air or coil, and it would cost just about as much to get this shock as it would to fix up their old shock. In my opinion, I would always go with getting a new shock because you never have to worry about if they fixed it right, if there's something else wrong with the shock, if it had a defect, anything like that. You just get a new one, and you might even get an upgraded shock like I did. So to recap, the Marzocchi Bomber CR is a coil shock that will give you the same feel out on the trail as a higher end shock with a smaller price tag. So last but not least, I do want to touch on the cons of the shock just a little bit more because I think that this review has been a little bit towards the pro, which is because, well, I really like this shock. So first con is climbing efficiency. Well, it's actually sort of a con, sort of a pro, depending on how you look at it. It can be a pro if you want maximum traction while climbing. If you live in an area with a lot of technical climbs, this shock will definitely benefit you. I don't have that much technical climbing, but on the little sections on the climbs that are more bumpy or rooty or rocky, I definitely felt like I had a lot better platform to push off. My tires slid around less, and the rear wheel just tracked the ground a lot better with the coil. However, it is less efficient. No matter which way you put it, coil will be less efficient than an air shock. Some people might care about this a lot, some people not that much, but if you regularly do big days on the bike, then maybe this shock isn't for you. You might want to stick with air so that you just have a more efficient bike that'll make big days easier. And the last con is that it's not as adjustable as other more higher end shocks. It only has low speed compression and low speed rebound. You never know, you might be used to having low and high speed compression, low and high speed rebound, in which case you might feel like you can't get the shock 100% dialed for your needs. That is totally up to you. It's kind of personal preference. For me, and I think the average rider, this shock will be plenty adjustable so that you can get it pretty much dialed. But if you really like your shock to feel 100% dialed, then this will not offer you the platform to get your shock absolutely 101% dialed, just the way you like it. And last but not least, the fourth and final con, the rebound is a little bit slow. Like no matter what, I have it fully open. I would appreciate one more click open. And with people that like their rebound even faster than me, then you won't be able to achieve that with this shock. The rebound just doesn't open fully enough to get that performance if that's what you like. So with that, I think the first ride impressions are just about over. I hope that you enjoyed it. And finally, actually, there's one more thing. If you have experience with the Marzocchi Bomber CR, please leave it along with your opinion in the comments. Who knows, you might help someone out. So if you enjoyed this review, then please consider leaving a like down below. If you really liked it and you want to see reviews just like this one, along with trail building and mountain biking, then consider subscribing and joining the community. Finally, leave any feedback you have in the comments. And I think that's it for me today. I really need to wash this bike. That is looking pretty dirty. I'll see you in a couple days.